Hi, I'm Rich Tabor with Cornell Cooperative Extension of Chenango County, New York, working with the Cornell Small Farms Grassland Utilization Team. And today we're going to be interviewing Rob DeClue here, who is a grazing expert from the Chenango County Soil and Water Conservation District. And the topic of today's film is going to be primarily focused on electric fencing, charging systems, and grounding and fault finding, and some of the issues that are inherent to making a very viable fencing system. So, Rob, tell me, how does an electric fence system work?
Well, the concept is it's a psychological barrier for livestock in the sense that they have to anticipate some kind of a negative consequence of challenging the fence. If they don't connect, that kind of expectation, then they're not going to respect the fence. And essentially what an electric fence charger does, it puts out electrical pulses periodically down the fence line and spaces them with basically no voltage, and as it's basically a safety feature, so that if either animals or people get entangled in the fence for whatever reason, between pulses they have the opportunity to hopefully extract themselves and get out of the fence. But those pulses, they have a very high voltage and actually a significantly high current, and those two properties basically provide, again, a very hard shock to the animal or whatever it may be that happens to touch the wire at that instant in time.
I see. Now, electric fences have been around for a long time. How do our fencing systems differ in this era than they did, say, back in the 50s and 60s?
The earlier fence energizers, or chargers as some people would call them, were what we call the high impedance type units. And those ones actually did not work very well. If there was even a moderate amount of weed load on the fence line, they would basically bog down to the point where, not that you'd want to do it, but you could almost touch the wire yourself with hardly any shocking power. And of course, under those conditions, the livestock wouldn't respect it, and you'd get animals getting it out of the fenced areas, and a lot of problems with that. About 25, 30 years ago, some of the new technology that originated in New Zealand, Australia, and some of the European countries made it into the North American continent. And these fence energizers generically are known as low impedance type energizers. They even have another category called wide impedance type energizers. But they differ markedly from the old-fashioned weed choppers from two aspects. One is safety. The old weed choppers were actually known to cause a number of fires in certain circumstances. These low impedance type units have much lower probability of that kind of occurrence. In addition to that, with the same kind of weed load that would bog down those old-fashioned weed choppers, these newer low impedance units, they'd still feel the effect of the weed load, but they would be able to still deliver a reasonable shock to the animals on the fence line and still have them respect it and be deterred from going through it. So that's the primary difference.
Well, Rob, you have a lot of hardware here, and you have a couple of fence chargers here. I see one. Why don't you show us that one over there, that one to your right there. Okay. All right, it says 6 joules. Tell me, what is all this stuff about joules? What's that entail?
One of the difficult things that farmers have is trying to select an energizer appropriate for their particular application. And the manufacturers have varied in the way they market and provide the specifications on the different units or models that they offer on the market. One unit of measurement is, as you point out, a joule, which is a unit of electrical energy. It combines basically voltage, amperage, as well as the duration of time that pulse is on the fence line. And it's an electrical calculation, and basically the higher the number of joules, the greater the electrical power in that single pulse going down the fence line. So a lower joule unit would be for either less number of linear feet of fencing, or another factor that influences how many strands on the fence line. If you have just one strand of hot wire, that's actually pretty easy for this kind of a unit or any kind of an energizer to basically energize. and keep it, in a pretty good high voltage rating, even with some weed load on it. But once you start adding, say, 2, 3, or upwards of 5 or 6 strands, those number of strands per linear foot makes it much harder for these energizers to keep them hot, especially if they're all hot strands. So
yeah, I've seen quite a few chargers now. They're increasing in capacity upwards of 20, 25 joules from different manufacturers, and those are pretty powerful fencers. Show us your other charger here.
This is another manufacturer, actually manufactured in the United States, Parmac. They've been around many years. Again, another option for farmers to basically select. This particular unit, if I may, again, at the bottom here you'll see one post is insulated. That goes to the hot wire. The other one is actually not insulated, so the whole case is the same electrical potential. That's the ground connection. So those are the kind of things that go on an Energizer.
So when you select a charger and then you go to install it, now you have to ground it. Tell us about grounding, Rob, and some of the common mistakes that people make with grounds, and talk about ground rods and how far apart they got to be, and and after that you can go into show us some of your testers here.
Well, Rich, grounding is so critical to the performance of these newer type energizers. Compared to the old-fashioned weed chopper, they actually put out a significantly higher current for each pulse that is sent down the fence line. And as a consequence, most of these energizers, the way they're set up with the fencing system, is that the ground itself, the earth, is the return circuit to bring that pulse back to the energizer. If the pulse that's sent out on the hot wire cannot get back to the ground terminal of the Energizer, it doesn't matter if you spend $50 on this box, $500, or even more, it will not perform adequately or up to expectations. What they call the earth return system for the Energizer is absolutely essential for it to perform up to expectations. And so because they have a higher current relative to the old-fashioned weed chopper, we actually need a much more extensive grounding system for these newer units than the farmers were used to on the old-fashioned weed chopper. So commonly when I would go to a farm and farmers, kind of ask for some kind of guidance, they'd show us the setup they had for the old-fashioned weed chopper, and it would usually be one ground rod, and sometimes, instead of having a good electrical contact from the ground wire to that ground rod, they may just wrap the bare wire around it, things like that. It's just totally inadequate for these type units. These units typically will need, and at least the average one, at least 3 8-foot ground rods embedded in the ground the whole length, and then spaced apart, or approximately 15 feet apart, in order for each of those ground rods to have the maximum influence and contact with the ground. Another very important aspect of that earth return system is that the grounding system for the Energizer should never be cross-connected or even in immediate proximity of any other grounding system on the farm, especially on dairy operations where there's milking cows near the milk center. The last thing you want to do is create a condition what they call stray voltage, because that has a significantly negative consequence on milk production and the animal's health. So the grounding system, again, for these newer type Energizers needs to be approximately 65 feet away or more from any other ground. And while most people may not think of it as a ground, on most farms now, we have drilled wells as a water source. The casing is usually metal. That is probably the best ground on the entire farm. And even though, again, people don't normally think of that as a grounding system, this ground system for the fence Energizer, again, should be at least 65 feet away from that metal well casing, because otherwise it will pick up stray voltage.
I see. And I see you have a number of testing implements here. Typically, when you go out to do maintenance on your fence, you need to check them to see how many, what is it, volts, is it amps? Tell us about your different testing instruments here.
These only measure voltage, and the newer type of testers that have come on the market are basically these digital ones. It has a liquid crystal display, and it basically instead of, again, looking at a neon bulb, is it lit or not, this is straightforward. It will tell you how many kilovolts, which is thousands of volts, that is on the fence line at the point of testing. And that has been the first advance. And these units, you know, they run under $50 you should be able to get these units for. Then they evolved and advanced into a newer type tester, and this one is generically called a fault finder. They're kind of like real easy to use because they actually have a fault finder kind of a circuitry built into it. So when you go to a point on the fence line and push the button, not only will it give a readout on the voltage and current, but if it's a real high current, it will actually have an arrow that will basically direct you to go down the fence line further until all of a sudden the arrow flips to the opposite direction, and that tells you that the problem that is in the fence is between the last two readings, and that makes it a lot easier to basically determine exactly where that problem is. So these units, that's just one manufacturer. This is another manufacturer. There's many of them on the market, and they run maybe a little over $100.
Well, Rob, we've covered a lot of ground, and it's obvious we could have many more films on electric fence systems, but we're out of time for today, and we certainly have covered a lot of topics here, and we hope the information will be of use to you. So on that note, this brings us to the end of this film, and thank you all for watching, and happy grazing.